So in this video, we're going to talk about how muscles and nerves have the ability to create electricity. And it's all based on something called polarization, depolarization, repolarization, and the roles of sodium and potassium ions in our bodies. Now, just a few facts about electricity. Remember, muscles contract because nerves tell them to. In the case of electricity, impulses are electrical currents running through a nerve cell. And nerve cells, if you remember, are called neurons. What allows our nerves to create these electrical currents is the ions sodium and potassium. And without sodium and potassium, neurons cannot make electricity. Now, in the case of neurons, you guys all know that electricity can shock things. So our bodies have to be real careful with how our neurons create electricity. And it causes a little problem that you're going to see in the end. But all cells have a buildup of sodium on the outside and potassium on the inside. Every cell in your body is like this. So if you had sodium on your back porch and everybody inside the house was potassium, that is how a cell is normally set up. And so because every cell has this, every cell has the potential to make electricity. So because of this buildup of sodium and potassium, all cells could make electricity. And so this is what we call the resting potential or the membrane potential. Because remember when people talk about somebody's potential, it's what they could do. Well, it's called the resting potential because at this point in time, the cells aren't doing anything. The cells are resting. They're not creating electricity. It's also called the membrane potential because this is how much electricity that membrane could make. And just so you guys know, it's about -70 millivolts for our cells. So because of this basic buildup of sodium outside the cell and potassium inside the cell, all of your cells have the potential to make electricity. However, most of our cells do not. And so this video is going to talk about how electricity gets made because we have to look at how nerves make electricity and nerves talk to the muscle cells and how then the muscle cells can create impulses in order to cause our muscles to contract. So as you can see here, in the case of how our bodies are going to actually make the electricity. So this little drawing here kind of shows you the cell when it's resting. So that means the cell is not creating electricity. And so you can see here that the yellow dots represent sodium and the green dots represent potassium. Well, sodium has a positive charge and potassium has a positive charge. And the way that our cell membrane is made up as a lipid bilayer, ions cannot pass back and forth across the membrane by themselves. You guys know like charges repel. So if a bunch of sodium were to start to rush into the cell, which has a positive charge, the positive potassium charge will just turn around and push them right back out. So in the case of our cells, when our cells are doing nothing, when we say that they have resting potential or they have membrane potential, this is also what we mean when we say polarization. So when the cell is doing nothing, so it's at resting potential or membrane potential, this is how much electricity it could make. We say that the cell is polarized. And in the case of our body cells, polarized would mean sodium is on the outside of the cell and potassium is on the inside of the cell. And like I mentioned, ions cannot pass through a membrane by themselves, just because of the makeup of the lipid bilayer and the fact that here, in this case, we have two like charges. Like charges are going to repel each other. So therefore, in order for ions to pass back and forth, we have proteins in our plasma membrane. They're called integral proteins. They're going to act like doors. But you know that doors cannot open and close by themselves. And so therefore, you have to get up and you have to open the door. And so our cells have to actually open that door. And all of your life, you guys have heard of threshold. Like somebody might say, well, I have a high threshold for pain. Well, threshold is a real thing. So I always talk about how threshold is what does it take to get a door to open. And different types of cells have different thresholds. For example, this is how your senses work. So right now, light is hitting the cones inside of your eyes. And your cones are one type of nerve cell. And what that light is doing is it's heating up those nerve cells. And when those cells heat up enough, a door opens. And that's going to allow that nerve to create electricity. Your sense of smell, it's chemicals. So those nerves have to absorb enough chemical in order for that door to open and it's to start to create electricity. So when we talk about threshold, I always talk about what does it take to open a door in order to let things in or out. And in the case of a nerve cell is what does it take to start that cell making electricity. And like I said, that door is not going to open up by itself. And so something is going to have to open that door. And so in the case of our body making electricity, when our nerve cells are doing nothing, they are resting. That's what we mean when we say that they are polarized. And what that means is sodium is on the outside of the cell and potassium is on the inside of the cell. Now something will cause that nerve to reach threshold. And in the case of the nerves that are talking to your muscles, it's going to be different chemicals, it's going to be different hormones. And these hormones are going to be called neurotransmitters. We'll talk more about those later. But hormones are ways that cells talk to each other. And in the case of nerves, even though nerves have electricity in them, you guys know that you can't put two live wires together without creating a spark, without shocking something. So nerves are actually not allowed to touch other nerves. They have to use hormones to talk to each other. And so when we have enough hormone, that's going to turn a nerve on. And when a nerve turns on, it's going to start creating electricity. And so when threshold is reached, a switch occurs. And basically what that means is, in the case of our nerve cells, when our nerve cells reach threshold, one of these doors will open. Okay? And so on here, you'll see sodium channel, you'll see potassium channel. A channel is just a special type of protein. So think of it as a door that we have to open and close in order to let things in or out. So in order for our muscles to work, our nerves have to create electricity to talk to our muscles. In order for our nerves to create electricity, they have to reach threshold. And when threshold is reached, one of these doors will open. Now, when this door opens, we're going to have what's called depolarization. Depolarization is when a swap takes place. Now, as you can see here, the positives represent sodium and the negatives represent potassium. And this is what we mean when we say a cell is polarized. Well, as soon as threshold is reached, think of it as a door swinging open and stuff is going to rush in. And you can see that happening here in this blue section. Well, what happens is, think of sodium as a bigger kind of bully, and sodium is going to rush into the cell as soon as that door opens, and it's going to pick up that potassium and throw it outside. Sodium wants to get into the cell. Potassium wants to stay in the cell. But when threshold is reached and that first protein channel, that first door opens, just because of laws of diffusion, going from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration, sodium is going to rush into the cell and potassium is going to rush out of the cell. So now it's opposite of what nature considers to be normal, and this is what we call depolarization. Now, when sodium and potassium pass by each other, that's going to create an electrical spark. So think of it as taking two rocks and striking them up against each other, and you get that spark in between the two. Well, when sodium goes rushing into the cell, it's going to help push potassium out. And think of potassium as this little kid who's just kind of fighting the bully. And so it creates this spark, and that is the start of the electricity. Well, that's then going to create a chain reaction. And so the spark will then, just like when you hit two rocks together or a match, and these little sparks fly off and can set other things on fire, all it takes is for one door to open. And when this spark gets created, it's going to open up more doors. And then sodium and potassium will swap places, you create a spark, which is going to open up more doors. And you can see how depolarization gets spread. It's going to spread in both directions. And this is what we call the action potential, because now the cell is actually doing something. So when the cell is normal, it's not doing anything, it's polarized. Sodium is outside, potassium is inside. Well, when threshold is reached and that first door opens up, sodium rushes in, potassium rushes out. It's like striking a match. You create sparks, and those sparks will open the next door, and it creates this chain reaction, and this is how electricity gets made. And so when the cell is doing nothing, it's resting potential. That's how much electricity it could make. Now the cell is actually doing something, so it's in action, And so the action potential is the electricity that we are making. So at this point in time, the cell is not happy. Think of it as you putting your shirt on backwards. You're not comfortable. Because remember, what's considered normal is sodium on the outside and potassium on the inside. And now it's backwards. So the moment the door opens up and you realize that all these hornets have come into your house, you're going to shut that door. Well, that's what your cells do. As soon as this swap takes place, and now the cell is going to shut the door. But now sodium is inside the cell and potassium is outside the cell. So again, think of it as you opening your door and a bunch of hornets rush into your house. And so you shut the door real fast so more hornets can't get in, but now you've got to get the hornets that are in your house out. You can also think of it as putting your shirt on backwards. It's not comfortable. So you want to take your shirt off and put it back on the way that it's supposed to. Well, that's what your cells are going to need to do. So the cells need to get the sodium back out and the potassium back in, but we've shut the door. And so we've got to very carefully open that door again to get the hornets out instead of letting more hornets back in. And so the cell is going to use a special door called the sodium potassium pump. And its job is to very carefully pump the potassium back into the cell and push the sodium right back out. So polarization would be like you sitting in your house, and then repolarization, you open the door and then all of a sudden all these hornets fly in. That's going to create a spark of electricity for you. And you're going to shut that door, that's depolarization, you're going to shut that door as fast as possible in order to keep more hornets from getting into your house, but now you've got to get the hornets out. So you very carefully open and close the door in order to push those hornets out so that more hornets don't get in at the same time. Well, that's, in this case, you're trying to put your house back to normal, trying to get those hornets back out, and this is what we call repolarization. And so repolarization is where you put everything back to normal. And so we have a special pump in order to push those hornets, in order to push that sodium back out of the cell, in order to bring that potassium back in. Now, the amount of time it takes for this whole transaction to happen is less than 1/1,000,000th of a second. It's incredibly fast. And this is what we call the refractory period. Now, this is basically how your cells are going to create electricity. And even though this unit is on muscles, we had to talk about electricity in order for you to understand how the muscle gets the information. How is the muscle going to get told, okay, hey, you need to contract, you need to change shape? And so just some things to remember. In the case of our muscle fibers, remember they're not called muscle cells, they're called muscle fibers. They have these long myofilaments, which is basically sarcomere. It's a chain of sarcomeres all lined up. It's like you taking a bunch of Legos and just stacking them on top of each other or lining them all up. And remember, sarcomeres are made from actin and myosin. Myosin is kind of hanging in the middle. It's like a swing. And when the myosin gets stimulated, it's going to pull on these ropes. And these ropes are going to pull the actin towards them, and that's going to cause the sarcomere to slide. And I do have a video on YouTube here that talks about how the structure of a sarcomere and how the sarcomere begins to slide. So if you're a little confused about that, make sure you search for that. It'll talk about, it's basically intro to muscles and muscle movement. Okay. Now, at the same time, electricity cannot pass from the neuron to another kind of cell. And so in the case of the neuron, it cannot touch the muscle cell. There will be a gap between the nerve cell and the muscle cell because the nerve cell is insulated just like the wires in your house, but we're not insulated. That's why a spark can shock us. And so there's actually a gap between the muscle cell and the nerve cell that we have to kind of get across in order to tell the muscle, hey, you need to contract. So we're going to focus on how the neuron tells the muscle fiber what to do if it can't shock it. We can't use a taser. That neuron cannot take a taser and shock that muscle cell because it'll burn that muscle cell, it'll destroy that muscle cell. But somehow we've got to tell that muscle, hey, I need you to wake up. So we're going to use hormones. So now the nerve is creating electricity, and the nerve is taking electricity to the muscle in order to tell the muscle, hey, I need you to contract. And so at the end of the neurons are often drawn as kites, and they have like these little bubbles at the very end, and these bubbles are what we call boutons. And inside of these little bubbles, they hold hormones called neurotransmitters. Neuro because the nerve is going to transmit something. Okay. Think of your parent as a neuron, and you are the muscle cell, and you are asleep in your bed. And your parent needs to wake you up, but your parent can't touch you. Your parent can't yell at you. Nerves don't talk. So your parent has 2 super soaker Nerf guns full of ice cold water. Well, the ice cold water would be the neurotransmitter, and the super soaker Nerf guns would be the boutons at the end of the neuron. Because the neuron cannot touch the muscle cell, it's got to wake it up somehow. So what it's going to do, it's going to use these neurotransmitters to these water guns, these boutons, to shoot this ice cold water at you. So as the neuron creates the electricity, it's going to trigger the boutons. And so just like if you were to shock me with electricity, so it would be like when your parents are getting ready to wake you up, they would sneak into your bedroom, but they can't touch you and they can't yell at you. So they're going to shoot you with super ice cold water. Now they have to make sure threshold is reached. They have to make sure that they shoot you with enough water. And in the case of nerves talking to muscle cells, the chemical that we use is a chemical called acetylcholine. So acetylcholine is a hormone that only works on certain types of muscle cells in order to wake those muscle cells up. So when your parents sneak into the room, they need to shoot you with enough in order for this threshold to get reached. So, if they were just to have like this little itsy bitsy eyedropper and you are sound asleep and they drop like a few drops of ice cold water on you, nothing is going to happen. So we're going to super soak you with that ice cold water, and that's going to create a reaction that's going to wake up parts of the muscle. Remember, one muscle is an organ. It has millions of cells inside of it. And so we only need to wake up a few cells to start this chain reaction. So when talking to a muscle, the bouton is going to shoot out a chemical called acetylcholine. And that acetylcholine will hit that muscle cell just like that ice cold water hitting your skin. And your skin absorbs that coldness, and that's what gets your reaction. Well, think about having a bunch of dominoes, and I only need to hit one domino in order to create a reaction where all the other dominoes fall down. And so your nerve cells are the same way. Remember, one muscle is an organ, and it contains millions of cells. So I only need to hit a few cells with this chemical in order to shock them so much that, think of it as being thrown backwards, so they hit the next domino, which hits the next domino, and that's going to create a chain reaction through the muscles in order to wake those muscle cells up. So you're sleeping, and this ice cold water has hit you, and it causes a reaction. Well, in the case of muscle cells, when the membrane absorbs the hormone, it becomes depolarized. So the muscle cells wake up because this shocking hormone, this shocking cold water, gets absorbed by them, and it causes this chain reaction. And our muscle cells will begin to create electricity in order to wake up the rest of the muscle. And so the impulse is going to move through the muscle by passing through special passageways called T-tubules. So our muscle cells, think of T-tubules as wires that run through the muscle. It's just like in your house. You have a light switch that's connected to all these different wires. And you just need to flick one light switch, and you can turn on 3 or 4 lights with that one light switch. Well, like I said, we only need to wake up 3 or 4 muscle cells, and they create this chain reaction, just like dominoes falling down. Well, this pathway that this current passes through are these things called T-tubules. Now, we do have a small problem, because better safe than sorry. When your parents need to wake you up from a dead sleep, they're going to dump a whole bunch of really, really cold water on top of you. And so most of that cold water is wasted because your skin's only going to absorb so much. The rest of it falls to the floor, or your bed absorbs it. Well, your nerves have to make sure that their muscle cells wake up. So they shoot out a lot of acetylcholine. Well, as long as acetylcholine is kind of sloshing around, our muscles can't repolarize. Our muscles can't go back to normal. So our body has a chemical called acetylcholinesterase Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with me and how I teach, this big word might be really, really, really scary to you. But anytime you see the ASE at the end of the word, that means it's an enzyme. And the name of the enzyme always tells you what it does. Okay. Ester is basically to destroy. So this is an enzyme that destroys acetylcholine because it's basically like you mopping up the floor. Okay. All this extra water fell to the floor and you need to mop it up. You need to get it out of the way so that you can go back to your normal life. Well, your muscle cells are the same way. Your neurons will shoot out so much acetylcholine that a lot of it gets wasted. And so our cells need to kind of mop it up before everything can go back to normal. So what's happening now is, remember, muscle cells aren't round, which is why we don't really call muscle cells, we call them muscle fibers. And structure determines function, and since muscle fibers have a different shape, some of their parts work a little bit differently. And all eukaryotic cells, cells that have a nucleus, have these subway systems in them. And I call these subway systems your endoplasmic reticulum. And endoplasmic reticulum are tubes that carry things through the cell. Well, in the case of muscle cells, muscle fibers, they have an extra job. Well, since they have an extra job, we need to give them a different name. So that's what's called the sarcoplasmic reticulum. It's still an endoplasmic reticulum. It's still a subway system that's going to move things. But in the case of our muscle cells, this subway system also stores calcium. Now, all of your life, you've heard that your bones need calcium. Well, your bones actually feed your muscle cells. Your bones store that calcium in order to give it to your muscles, because without calcium, your muscles will not work correctly. So as soon as this impulse hits the sarcoplasmic reticulum, they release large amounts of calcium. And it's the calcium that basically kind of flicks the light switch. And the calcium tells myosin, okay, myosin, start to pull on your ropes. Because remember, myosin, which is this protein that's part of the sarcomere, is just kind of hanging there. It's like it's swinging. And it's just waiting to be told what to do. So when calcium is released into our muscle cells, that's the trigger for myosin to start to pull. And when myosin starts to pull on the actin, your sarcomere will begin to condense. And when the